January, we had part one of this event where we watched a segment of the documentary, the PBS documentary that I highly recommend that you take the time to watch all of, called Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. It's free to watch on YouTube. It may be available on other platforms, but that's where I've been watching it. So we'll go ahead and start with our introduction. Invite you all to get a beverage and a snack, have your charger close by, have paper and pen ready. We will be journaling, and set aside anything that may distract you. Feel free to take a few moments to follow us on social media if you haven't already. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and we will be showing a recording of the event on YouTube every month. And you can also get reminders about our events and things that are going on with our organization through our social media. So a little about us. Baltimore Racial Justice Action is a network of Maryland individuals committed to social transformation with an emphasis on racial equity. BRJ was officially founded in 2003, but had its roots in the Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996. BRJ is a program of Fusion Partnerships, 501c3 nonprofit organization. So our work, here at BRJA, we offer these monthly 13th of the month events, and we also do consultations for organizations and free monthly dialogue events on the intersection of race and other societal issues. To learn more about our public workshops or consultations or 13th of the month events, feel free to visit us at bemoreantiracist.org. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to talk more about our event for next month.
Thank you. And before that, I'll talk about the way that you can donate to BRJA or become a monthly sustainer. You can do that at bemoreantiracist.com/donate. You can be a monthly sustainer as well as $1 a month. And then if you would like to be $1,000 a month, that's great also too. But you can visit us there. These events are free, and we're able to do those based on your contribution each month on the 13th. So as Michelle was saying, next month, October 13th, we're going to be doing an event on respectability politics. Excited to bring that to you all. We were doing some more planning on that today. And our conversation for the 13th, it's going to be a little bit different than some of our last Zoom 13th has been. It's going to be kind of workshop style, cross conversation. A lot of times people enter the conversation on respectability politics, and it's Black people talking and everyone else just listening. If that cross conversation does happen, what's going to be different about this event is we're going to have cross conversation across race. The way that respectability politics operate and are perpetuated, not just with Black people, but with non-Black people too. So we're excited to see you for that on October 13th.
Thank you, Anthony. So we're going to move into our program for the evening. We're going to be watching actually the third segment of this documentary. It's about a 5 or 6 long segment documentary. Once again, you can find it on YouTube. It's a PBS documentary called Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, and it's narrated by Henry Louis Gates. It's really well done. I think, if you do have time to watch it in its entirety, it's definitely time well spent. So we'll actually be watching the third segment today, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about our event back in January of this year when we watched the first segment. And at that time, as a nation, we found our Capitol being stormed by white extremists. And so when we had that event, people saw a lot of parallels between what was happening during the Reconstruction period, where white people feeling threatened by Black political power were using violence and force to implement their will. And so it was so interesting having that event in January when we were having things happen in our own country at the same time. Since then, we've seen sweeping legislation nationwide on the state level, which has threatened the vote of Black and Brown people in this country. So that's one of the parallels to this time period that's happening currently. The segment that we're going to be watching actually starts in the early 1880s. And it's at the end of the Reconstruction period. And I have this quote up by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's actually mentioned in the documentary because I just think it's really poignant in encapsulating what was happening during this time period. And I'll read it for you. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back towards slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois. And yeah, I just wanted to share that with the group about how this really does, unfortunately, characterize this really painful and violent period in American history. Next slide, please. I just want to give a little bit of background history on the Reconstruction period for people who didn't join us in January, or if you don't have any knowledge about this time in history, just to give a little bit of historical context before we start the film. It was the period right after the Civil War between 1865 and 1877. During that time, there were attempts made by our national government to implement constitutional rights to Black Americans. And that's when the 13th Amendment was passed, which would have been emancipation. The 14th Amendment, which would have given civil rights and equal rights to Black people, basically giving them citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment, which would have been the right to vote, which would have been given to Black men, because at that time, women still were not allowed to vote in this country. During this period, we had 16 Black congressmen and 2 Black US senators. The Reconstruction period ends with the Compromise of 1877. Basically what happened in this country is we had an election where it was unclear about who, about 3 states in the South, their election results were unclear. That might sound familiar to you all. And so as a compromise, the Republicans and the Democrats got together and decided that if Rutherford B. Hayes, which was the Republican candidate, would be president, then the Democrats would pull their troops from the South. So that is what happened. And that was basically put the nail in the coffin for the Reconstruction period in 1877. And now we can move to the segment of the film, unless there's any questions or comments from the audience about what we're going to be watching. I do want to give some context and say that there is a lot of images of lynching in this segment that we're going to be watching. So just as a content warning to the audience. All right, if there are no questions, we are going to go ahead and start the film. Feel free to journal during that time. We will have discussion questions after that we'll discuss as a group. All right, so we're gonna put a few discussion questions up. We'll give you about 5 minutes to think about the discussion questions and journal quietly, and then we'll come back as a group and discuss. Okay, if we can, if everyone could put themselves on video for the discussion. I know we have a small group tonight, so I feel like that might help the discussion portion. Hello, everyone. So the Discussion questions are in the chat for people to refer back to. Would anyone like to start us off? Anything that is really hitting them after watching the film? Anything that they want to share that they came up with after writing the reflection questions and journaling?
Yeah, I was it's a pretty somber video clip. There were a lot of lynching photos. That was hard to watch. And then also just thinking about, I saw an exhibit within the past few years of lynching photos that just focused, they were taken from lynching photos, but they focused on the white crowds. I thought that was a really interesting way to illustrate the depravity of whiteness at those events without also having this sort of consuming of Black pain, all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was a really interesting way to do it. So yeah, I'm having a lot of thoughts come up about that.
Thank you, Dana. Yeah, I'm thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that, I don't know if people know this, that people would take pictures at these lynchings and actually turn them into postcards and send them to people. So that was just something that I was thinking about as you were sharing that.
I think that's interesting that you bring up, Dana. I would have liked to have seen what it is that you're talking about, because in my experience, it was a little bit more careful and like more discretion away that the images showed the lynchings compared to what I had seen before. Because to me, it did feel like, now that I focused and caught maybe every single one of them, but it was like a little bit zoomed out, and that it wasn't, I've seen some where they start and they're just focused on the body that is hanging or zoomed in, and it's very graphic. And so that was something that stood out to me, that I was like, oh, whoever, we're talking about, not to get into the behind the scenes of the film, but I was like, oh, that is interesting. And while that was hard to watch, it also felt like there was caution used around it. And then the other part that was evoked an emotional feeling was around Ida B. Wells. It was like a sense of proudness.
Yeah.
Her resistance, and she was really up against some scary, frightening times. And to be like, you know what, I'm just put a pistol in my purse and still keep doing my work. That is, yeah, that's phenomenal.
I agree. She's one of my personal sheroes that I admire so much. And I love that they even took that chunk of time during the documentary to highlight her, because I think that so much when we talk about African-American heroes and figures in history, right? Like they tended to be men, right? They tend to be Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois. And I don't know that she gets her just due, unfortunately, because she is a woman. So I agree with that, Anthony. Anything else that's coming up for people?
I was thinking about that Supreme Court justice whose name I'm not remembering, who basically said, we're tired of dealing with this. We're tired of dealing with Black people talking about racism. And so can't everything just be fine now?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I was like, oh yeah. Just thinking about various iterations of ways that that still echoes today, and sort of seeing this through line of white people just being, yeah, it might have been Anthony. That seems, but just being like, I'm done. And white people feeling that their discomfort in looking at racism is somehow stronger than the actual living with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. And also that this continuing theme of that the few times in our history when we've tried to make things right for Black people and tried to repair past harms, that now it's considered preferential, right? We have a lot of language today about handouts and things like that, that anytime when we're even just trying to repair past harms, it's made a big deal and seen as like this special thing that's happening for Black people. I believe that when Barack Obama was running, I forget, I think it was a Republican woman, I forget her name, and she said something about, oh, he's just popular because he's Black. I'm like, what? Since when? Or, you know, has that been a positive thing, right? So yes, definitely a recurring theme. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, and like along with that, this sort of like surprise that a little bit of work hasn't resolved. So this like, continued lack of acknowledgement of the depth and legacy of history of years and years and years and years and years of harm.
Yeah.
And just being like, well, can we just, why is this not better with just a Band-Aid?
Right, right.
Yeah.
The Reconstruction lasted, what, not even 15 years, and slavery lasted over 200 years. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Anything else that's coming up for people?
I thought while doing the process first that this reminded me that I can use this for my students for my civil rights movement elective that I'm currently teaching, because we're right at the place where I'm building a foundation of the 1800s Reconstruction, because many of them thought, oh, it started in 1950s. And I'm like, no, 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 no. And so tomorrow, as we discuss, they've had some readings to do. As I was watching the video, I was like, Friday, this is what we're watching, so that they can put what they've read to see it, with me giving them the Cliff Note versions, like, okay, there's going to be some lynching, let's be prepared. But they're juniors and seniors, and they have been asking, you know, why are we still where we are? And so I'm hoping this pushes them until we get to that 1900s. But I so love them showing, I agree with you, Ida B. Wells, because I often think women were not brought to the forefront, and yet they were instrumental in doing lots of things. So this just reminded me that this was a source that I could use for my students, and they will have to, we'll watch it on Friday. So thank you very much.
That's exciting to hear. Yeah, it's really well done. So it was done in 2019, so it's fairly new as well. So great, that's exciting. You teach here in Baltimore City?
Yes, I'm at the Park Schools of Baltimore.
Okay, great.
Cool. Just moved here from Texas.
Oh, welcome.
Thank you.
We'll see you at more 13th.
Yes.
Anything else that's coming up for folks? Parallels, things you didn't know?
I've been thinking so much lately about not just the denial, but the deliberate suppression of the truth through generation after generation after generation in white families. And this just shows how powerful that suppression of knowledge and all of those postcards, and how many kids never knew that their grandmothers and great grandfathers were sending these things to their friends.
Yeah.
It was just all buried. So that when BRJA began in the early 2000s, working with white people in the White People's Workshop series, it just hit me a couple of years ago that I never heard a single white person talk about their parents or their grandparents describing the horrors, the violence, the murders that happened in the town that their family was from. And it happened in every town.
Yeah.
The massive suppression of memory and passing down the truth is so at the root. And I can just imagine the grandchildren of people having children now talking about this time period and suppressing the truth of what's happening in Texas and
Yeah.
Florida and so many places.
No, that's very true, Dottie. Yeah, there's been something I've been seeing go viral lately on social media where people are asking their white friends on social media, like, did your parents or grandparents ever talk to you about how they didn't like Black people back in the day, right? Like, so it is interesting that, yeah, there is a lot of silence. There is a lot of this romanticizing of the past, right? Like, oh, we all agreed with Martin Luther King, and I think his ratings were something like 20%, before he died, right? So yeah, I definitely agree with that, Dottie. The silence is crazy.
Wow, and I'm reflecting on what Dottie said, because I'm thinking of my own family, of course. And I'm thinking, yeah, I should never heard that. And now I'm thinking, like, yeah, I mean, my mother's mother was the most openly racist person I've probably known till today, and yet we all just shut her up. And like, I don't know, like, the stories. I don't know what she saw or was involved in, or did she have postcards? I mean, none that I or my mother ever knew, but I don't know, it just makes me think, like, we all just shut her up rather than want to ask any questions, I suppose. But maybe that's part of the problem. We didn't ask questions. Just shut up, Grandma.
Makes me think too that I've always found it very interesting that white people have always been able to say, this is my lineage, this is my ethnicity, my family came to the United States at this point of time, but have not ever been able to pinpoint, when we're talking about racial history, where that family landed in that. And oftentimes it's positioned at, did your family own slaves? But this part of the film made me think about, or was your family part of the working class, that broke off from Black people and prioritized like their wants, their needs, and that put their privilege first? Was your family, so it's always positioned in a way of like, only did they enslave us or not? But these different points in history where white people did not resist and moved in their own interest and did acts against Black people that don't happen in that conversation. So yeah.
Thank you, Anthony.
I was thinking about that with the populists, which I had, I think in my US history class, learned in the context of white Midwestern farmers and not as a multiracial coalition. And so as someone descended from Midwestern farmers, it makes me wonder about, those great grandparents and, what coalitions were there and what coalitions were broken and what was seen as not here, not related to us in this, overwhelmingly white state of Iowa. And so it's not relevant. And so this sort of using the excuse of distance to distance oneself from the harm.
Thank you, Rebecca. Any other?
Yeah, and thinking about how, so relating to that and what Anthony and Dottie said, that the way that my parents were from Michigan and Minnesota, and the way in which they, and it wasn't explicit, but the sort of implicit distancing of, racism is something that happens in the South, and that comes from Southern whites. It certainly doesn't come from Northern whites. We're not part of that. So, the sort of like, well, we didn't enslave people after a certain point up in the North, therefore we can just say we're we're good with this. So yeah, all the sundown towns and all the explicit racism and terror and all just gets disappeared. Like that he was saying, or and in particular, my family's history is that one, is that, well, yeah, that wasn't a problem up here. And and then, and also there were only white people up there. So where did the Black folks go? Like that's, we don't talk about that though.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I lost my train of thought that fast. What was I gonna say? No, yes, this whole narrative that like, oh, only the South is where it's a problem, right? And that, in talking about the Reconstruction, even before it actually officially ended in 1877, it was already unpopular. So the North, oh, we're gonna go down here and get the South straight and we're gonna send troops down there. After less than 10 years, they were, oh, it's too much money, we're not interested. And they full well knew what was gonna happen to Black people when they pulled those troops. They had full understanding of what was going to happen with lynch mobs and the KKK. They weren't ignorant of that fact, and they still decided that they just weren't interested in helping. So, where's the culpability then for, Northern whites? Yeah, and it's not as if the KKK only existed in the South, right? It was a nationwide thing. So thank you for that, Dana. Were there any other thoughts or comments before we close?
Just one other thing. We talk a lot in our workshops about how white supremacy is not an extremist thing. It's not only a Klan thing. It's sort of foundational. And watching all the pictures and the videos from the World's Fair, the newspaper things, just the common sort of pervasive everydayness of the absolutely explicit racism.
Yeah.
That most white people didn't blink an eye at.
Yeah.
And so when we think about our history, and that's what the history is that absolute common and pervasive stuff. And then all of a sudden, at some point historically, and Adar knows this history to say it, I don't, but at some point, white folks start pretending that that's not what our common pervasive history is, but then that's something only held by Southerners and only by extremist Southerners at that.
Yeah.
And so I find it so useful to see some of this stuff and help remind me that no, this is very, very common US thing.
Yeah.
And so not to distance ourselves like that he was talking about.
Yeah. Thank you, Dana. Yeah, I was really struck when Henry Louis Gates asked Brian Stevenson who was a part of the lynch mobs. I love that he asked that question. And then he's like, clergy, like, business owners, right? Like the lynch mob weren't these separate group of people that lived outside of the town, right? It was comprised of the people who lived there. And I love that he listed, specifically who made up those groups. So, yeah.
There was a lynching in Dallas. One of the classes I worked with before I left Texas did research. The teacher taught a human rights class, and there was a lynching in the early 1900s of this gentleman who never was convicted. It was only alleged, and they drug him several blocks. Well, because it was in downtown Dallas, by the time they made it to the arch where they would eventually hang him, people had come out the hotels. So there ended up being hundreds of people, and the Dallas Public Library actually has one of the postcards. And so you see all these people and children, but yet no one was arrested because they couldn't name any of those people. And so as they were showing that on the video, I thought of that because the kids actually researched it, and we walked from the red courthouse in silence until we got to where the arch was. And the number of students that were crying by the time we made it, it was just, the first time I went, I was bawling too, because we actually dug dirt to send to Brian Stevenson's EJI for the, in honor of this person, to make sure Dallas was there. And it was just overwhelming to see. And then we also showed them what the public library had, the archives that they had. And just to see the clips from that, what just reminded me how powerful primary sources, secondary sources can be. And no matter what law Texas has, as long as we use those primary sources in order to teach our students, and whether it's our students or whether we're at the church or the rec center or whatever, is that still gives them the history, regardless of whatever. I'm also a librarian too. And so if we use those sources, that's what we have to stand on in order to make sure all voices in history is told. That's just something we have to commit to and to lay forward, because we're doing a disservice not putting all voices into history.
Exactly. Thank you. It's now 7:36. Thank you all for this discussion and joining tonight. I know it's a Monday. We all could have been doing different things. So thank you for your time and your willingness to watch this together and then discuss it together. Dana, could you put up our closing slide? If you haven't already, please follow us on social media. And if you would like to donate, please do. We are a nonprofit, small nonprofit organization, and we appreciate all donations. And if there are no other questions or comments, we'll go ahead and close.
Thank you, Michelle.
So
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
See you all next month.
Bye-bye.